Guys, welcome to my new video, and today we'll be looking at Restoration Druid, and this guide is going to be looking at mythic plus, it's going to be looking at raids, it's going to be looking at the playstyle, a lot of emphasis on the playstyle. I'll be looking at some of the macros and basically tips and tricks about making your Resto Druid feel better or do better in a lot of the high-end content. So let's go and get started with the video, and we're going to be looking at talents. Now, first of all, this is my Resto Druid, and we're going to be looking at raid talents for Resto. There is a certain amount of talents that you can kinda pick and choose, but generally speaking, this is probably going to be your most popular build for Castle Natria. In tier 15, I honestly going to say that there is a lot of people using Abundance, and if you are using Abundance, you need to make sure you have a lot of rejuvenations out, and you can actually use Regrowth as a filler or, you know, a healing ability. Now, if you play the Resto Druid for a really long time, you'll probably notice that it's kind of hard to get used to the playstyle where Regrowth is actually part of your rotation. A lot of the times, if you played Resto Druid for years, you basically relied on your HOTS. And I do think Scenario Ward is a very, very solid pick if you cannot get used to the fact that Regrowth is a filler. Like myself, I still fully rely on rejuvenations, blanketing the raid with rejuvenations, and then just, you know, if someone is really about to die, I'm gonna use Regrowth as the last kind of resort. So Scenario Ward, if you're still doing this kind of playstyle, it's very, very solid. Use it on a tank. A lot of the times you just use it on cooldown. It can be extended by Flourish, so keep that in mind if you really want to min-max it. But again, a lot of times it's between Scenario Ward or Abundance. If using Abundance, you will be using a lot more Regrowth. So tier 15, tier 25, a lot of people are going Renewal. That's actually super solid talent at this given point, both in Mythic Plus and Raids. Wild Charge, if you know you can make use of this, because you are going to be using Night Fae and you're gonna have a lot of movement. A lot of people don't really need that Wild Charge anymore, so they do go with the extra oh crap button with Renewal. So again, very popular two options here. Tier 30, honestly, you can pick any of these. If you're doing progression rating, you might gonna go with Guardian Affinity for the damage reduction. Balance Affinity is very popular because of the fact it's going to extend or the range of all abilities by 5 yards, and it can be useful especially in large raids where a lot of people are spread out. But again, very free, or there's a lot of options here. Tier 35, most people are going to go with Heart of the Wild. If you are trying to optimize your Resto Druid like mythic rating, you might be trying to provide some DPS during off healing moments when there's no healing going. There is a lot, and you'll notice that if you're doing mythic rating, there's a lot of bosses that have tight DPS checks, and everybody has to DPS, including healers. So Heart of the Wild can actually be a solid option here. Tier 40 always, or majority of the time, is going to be Tree of Life. You could make Soul of the Forest work, even. We'll talk about it later on in Mythic Plus section, but majority of the time is going to be Tree of Life. With Tree of Life, you're going to have additional bonus to using a lot of your abilities, including Wild Growth and Rejuvenation. And a lot of the times, you'll just be trying to spam Rejuvenation and making sure you have Wild Growth in there, but we'll talk about that in the gameplay section. Tier 45, honestly, you can make both Inner Peace and Spring Blossoms work, but with Inner Peace, you need to make sure you know exactly why using Inner Peace or how you're going to fit in that extra tranquility. And for a lot of people, they might not know the exact length of the boss fight. They're not sure if they're gonna squeeze in the extra tranquility, and because Castle Natria is relatively stacked, Spring Blossoms becomes a really solid option, and tier 50 is going to be Flourish. The only time I can see Flourish not being used in raids if you're using double Light Bloom Legendary and you want to experiment with photosynthesis. And because double Light Bloom Legendary works really well with photosynthesis, you might use it in that situation, but Flourish is just going to be the go-to for majority of Resto Druid or Druids who are raiding in Castle Natria. Now let's go to the Mythic Plus. And this is probably going to be the most popular Mythic Plus talent build for Resto Druid, and I need to talk about a couple of things here because they're more relevant towards people who are pushing really high keys. First of all, tier 15 Scenario Ward is very popular. You have to remember, Scenario Ward, they give you HOTS. The more HOTS you have, the more mastery stacks you're gonna get. Resto Druid is all about getting more HOTS on specific amount of people. The more HOTS you have on them, the more healing you're going to be doing. In raid situations, it can be difficult to have a lot of them because you have like 20 people. In Mythic Plus, where you have 5 people, having more HOTS, especially on a tank when tanks are getting really wrecked in this expansion or this season 1, having Scenario Ward contribute towards the mastery stack and give you heals is very important. So a lot of the times this is going to be your number one pick. There are people who do use Abundance. I've seen people using Abundance in high keys, but majority of the time Scenario Ward is going to be very, very popular. Tier 25, like I mentioned before, Renewal is going to be very popular because you do have that movement from Night Fae. Wild Charge is still used, so again, very personal preference. Tier 30 is always, and this is going to be very, very important. I'm going to be doing a DPS guide at the end of the video. Balance Affinity, Boomkin. There is an DPS rotation associated with this, and it's one of the reasons what makes Resto Druid burst DPS really strong. When you combine Boomkin or Balance Affinity with Heart of the Wild, with the fact that you have Convoke the spirits from Night Fae, you're getting this 1, 2, 3 DPS rotation that can actually provide an insane amount of burst. And we'll talk about the macros that you can use for Convoke to combine with your trinkets, to combine with your potions, to even have a bigger burst. And all of a sudden, Resto Druid burst DPS is one of the best in the game at this given point. Probably Holy Paladin might try to disagree with that, but generally speaking, Balance Affinity is going to be the main way to go in mythical situations, because being melee kinda sucks. Having Typhoon is a lot more convenient than using Maim. So all of a sudden, Balance is going to be used by majority of people pushing high keys, especially with the fact that there's going to be Sanguine, where Typhoon is going to be a lot of use. Like I mentioned, Heart of the Wild is going to be picked. Now, tier 40 is going to be Soul of the Forest. Soul of the Forest made a comeback because of the fact that the cooldown of Swiftman has been reduced in Shadowlands. So all of a sudden, Soul of the Forest is a really cool option. The way the Soul of the Forest is going to work is going to be different, because the way that I talked about Swiftman is going to be different. I'll talk about this in gameplay section, but generally speaking, when you're going to be using Swiftman, you're going to have a buff where you can empower your Wild Growth, empower your Regrowths, empower your Rejuvenations. In mythical situations, a lot of the times you'll be empowering Regrowths, but honestly, it really depends on what you need. If you need AoE healing, you might be using it on Wild Growth. So it's very, very, very flexible. It's very similar to Mistweaver, Thunder Focus Tea as well. It's basically a copy of that spell. So tier 45, Spring Blossoms, majority of the time in mythical situations. And tier 50, this is very, very important. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but Flourish. Why am I saying Flourish in mythical? The most popular for really high key pushes, because most of the Resto Druids want to use their Convoke, which you get from Night Fae, which is your number one Covenant ability. They want to use Convoke the Spirits for DPS. That means they're exposed. They don't have a healing cooldown available if they use things like Photosynthesis. So they tend to pick Flourish to give them an additional cooldown when dealing with Prideful. Is Flourish mandatory? Absolutely not. You need to have a proper knowledge, or why are you using Flourish in order to pick it. Photosynthesis at the end of the day can provide you good consistent single target healing by using Life Bloom on a tank, or good consistent AoE healing by using Life Bloom on yourself. It requires a little bit more finessing, and it has an insane synergy with double Life Bloom Legendary that I'll talk about later on. So in tier 50, honestly, make up your mind in terms of what you want to do. If you're pushing high keys and you really want to provide additional DPS, but you don't want to be exposed without having any cooldowns for something like Prideful, Flourish is very, very solid, on top of the fact that Flourish is also going to extend Scenario Ward. If you don't care about the healer DPS, you just want to get through the key, and you want consistent good healing, you might look into Photosynthesis. And this is my talents for Mythic Plus. Let's go and have a look at the Covenants for Resto Druid. Now, Covenants for Resto Druid is only really one, and that is Night Fae, and that is including Convoke the Spirits. Now, Convoke the Spirits is going to call upon the Night Fae for Eruption of Energy, Channeling, and Rapid flurry of 12 Druid spells and abilities over 4 seconds. It will cast Wild Growth, Swiftman, Moonfire, Rat, and nearby targets favoring the current shape-shifting form. This ability is extremely flexible, become the staple for actually most of the Druid specs, and it's very, very easy to swap from something like a Resto Druid to Balance Druid, because both of them like Convoke the Spirits. So at the end of the day, why is it so popular? It is going to provide either DPS or healing, and you can choose which one you want to do. In raid situations, majority of the time you'll be using it to provide healing, and in Mythic Plus situations, if you're doing high keys, you'll probably be using this to provide DPS. So you have a lot of options, and you can provide DPS in different shapes or forms. You can use it in your Boomkin affinity if you have Balance affinity, or you can use it in your Feral form if you have Feral affinity. This is like an oh crap button in healing moments when you feel like everyone's going to die. You have to keep in mind that if you're trying to provide healing, you need to stay in your normal form. This is going to prioritize healing abilities. And if you're trying to provide DPS in a Boomkin form, you kind of need to stay away from the melee form, because if you pop Convoke, it might start using some abilities like Trash and things like that, and you don't want them. You want to prioritize your Boomkin abilities, your DPS abilities, because you're in your Boomkin form. So Flexibility is the key. Let's go have a look at some of the Soulbinds and Conduits that are very popular for Night Fae. So once again, we're looking at questionably epic in terms of providing information about Covenants, about stat priority, and how to maximize your healing. And this is the Covenant Exploration tool for Night Fae. And honestly, the main choice, because we're looking at Renown 24, 26, depending on which week you are in, Dreamweaver is probably going to be your #1 option for majority of the content in terms of Mythic Plus and raids, with Naya might coming in for sunking, and we might talk about sunking optimization in Castle Natche. But Dreamweaver, why is it so popular? Why is it so good? Because of the fact you have Empowered Chrysalis, and this is going to be really strong in raids, and the fact that you have double potency conduit unlocked if you want to use it. So this is going to be a build that you're going to be using in raids. So Paw Tender is meme ability already. A lot of people have been using this. It's basically cheat dead every 10 minutes. It can be insanely useful. So again, you pick this, you go Endurance Conduit, you go with Well-Honed Instinct. You can see that it actually has a high HPS value already. Well-Honed Instincts is insane. When you fall below 40% health, you cast Frenzy Regen up to every 90 seconds. You don't have to go into bear form. This does not proc bear form. This just gives you a heal when you drop. It is insanely good, and it's one of the reasons why balanced druids and druids are generally really strong, at least in survivability in terms of PvP. So it is a no-brainer. After that, you have a potency conduit. Your #1 potency conduit in raids and Mythic Plus is going to be Unstoppable Growth. Unstoppable Growth, you can see here, provides 91 HPS value in raid situations and 95 in dungeon situations. So it does change accordingly. Let's look at what it does. Wild Growth healing falls off 20% less over time. This is a really, really solid HPS potency conduit that's going to provide a good amount of healing, because Wild Growth is your bread and butter ability as a Resto Druid. You're going to be picking this no matter what. And after this, you have a choice. I'm talking about the raid situation here, and you're probably in raids going to pick Empowered Chrysalis. So 10% of your overhealing received or done remains as a shield on the target up to 10% of the caster's health lasting 5 seconds. This is insanely strong in raid situations, because Resto Druid cannot really control the overhealing that well. You might have rejuves, wild ghosts, and things like that. And if a person is full HP, your rejuvenation is still going to be ticking, is going to be adding this to the shield. So all of a sudden, this is the way to go in raids. And you'll see, and I'm going to be using data here from Warcraft logs to showcase some of the most popular builds for Resto Druids doing mythic content. You can see here Empowered Chrysalis is pretty much the go-to for majority of content, except for sunking, where you'll see Growth Invigoration being picked, which is part of Naya tree, which again, sunking is all about the single target, so getting additional mastery is pretty strong. But we're talking about raids, and Empowered Chrysalis is the way to go. After that, again, Finesse Conduits are not here. Endurance Conduit, Innate Resolve is pretty good as well. It has a HPS value associated with it, where Growth and Frenzy Regen healing is increased. So all of a sudden, this is probably going to be a build for raid situations. What happens if you want to do Mythic Plus? This changes significantly, because all of a sudden Empowered Chrysalis is not something that you really want to get in Mythic Plus, because it has diminished values, because again, it's only 5 members. So all of a sudden, you might go with a build of Unstoppable Growth, Well-Honed Instinct, and then you're going to go left. You're going to pick Soothing Voice, which again is whatever, but you're going to go for double potency. And for double potency, you're going to pick Conflux of Elements. Conflux of Elements is your second best potency conduit in terms of pure HPS value, and it's going to wild channeling convoke the spirits. Your damage and healing are increased by 15%. Super flexible, really popular. And if you look at Mythic Plus data, don't take my word for this, you can go and look at Sub Creation, and this is going to list one of the most popular talent builds. It's going to list one of the most popular legendaries that are available, and it's also going to look at the most popular builds in terms of conduits. You can see a lot of people are using Conflux of Elements, they're using Unstoppable Growth. There's a lot of people here who are using double potency, and it's very, very, very popular in Mythic Plus situations. So again, this is definitely backed up by the data from real players, and Questioning Epic showcases a good build here that you can use as a Resto Druid, both in Mythic Plus and raids. And once you go to high renowned levels, you can go and pick Field Blossoms, and that's going to be a solid HPS gain as well. So now let's have a quick glance at Resto Druid Legendaries. And honestly, this is probably the most convoluted section for healer, because there is so many decent legendaries for Resto Druid, and there's so many different metas available based on what you want to do. So if you want to have one legendary that's gonna fit Mythic Plus and raid situations, gonna provide good HPS for Mythic Plus, gonna provide good HPS for raids, I have to say Memory of Mother Tree. Now, using Questionable Epic, you have different options. This is showing the raid HPS, and this is showing dungeon HPS. So you can see Memory of Mother Tree is pretty much in the top 2 for both Raid and Mythic Plus. All of a sudden this legendary becomes a very solid option for a player who's just looking to get one legendary, looking to get it to 235. Again, you can have legs or wrists. Much of the time you're going to be picking legs. You might be, you know, if you're focusing on Mythic Plus, you might be putting haste and mastery on this. If you're focusing on raids, you might be putting haste crit or haste or verse in terms of stats. But generally speaking, honestly, this is a great legendary for a person who's looking to have one legendary. Focus on that. Great for all content. If you're looking to optimize your Resto Druid in raid situations, only raid situation, you're looking for the biz legendary for raids, we're looking at Vision of Unending Growth. Rejuvenation is a 2.5 chance to create a new rejuvenation on a nearby target. This is going to be per tick of rejuvenation. So generally speaking, if you have more haste, this is going to become even better, and it's one of the reasons why haste is one of the best stats both in Mythic Plus and raid situations. So why should you get this? You should get this if you're focusing in raid situations. This is not great in Mythic Plus. You're not going to be using this in Mythic Plus in order to optimize your Mythic Plus performances Resto Druid. You're purely going to be using this for raids. You can craft the head of feet in terms of the stats, and in raids, like I mentioned, haste, crit, haste verse is very, very popular in terms of what you want to, or the stats you want to get. So if you want to focus on Mythic Plus only, and you're not really caring about raids that much, you can go and swap to the dungeon setup here, and you can start seeing the Dark Titan's Lesson. This is your double Life Bloom legendary. You may apply Life Bloom to 2 targets at once. Your Life Bloom healing is reduced by 10%. This has an insane synergy with photosynthesis. Now, like I mentioned, I do have this legendary. I put in Haste Mastery on it because Haste Mastery are arguably your best stats in Mythic Plus, and I'm only going to be using Dark Titan's Lesson in Mythic Plus situations. Now, I have a weak card that also tells me, hey, do I have Life Bloom on myself? Do I have Life Bloom on a tank? It has an insane synergy, like I talked about this before, with photosynthesis, so I might consider using photosynthesis if I'm using this legendary. My personal opinion about this, the pure HPS value out of it is really, really nice, but the gameplay aspect feels like it uses up a lot of your global cooldowns in order to... It almost feels like a chore to do. So all of a sudden I have to always make sure, do I have Life Bloom on myself? Do I have Life Bloom on a tank? It doesn't really provide the same kind of finesse that photosynthesis without the legendary used to do in terms of like, do I keep Life Bloom on the tank because they need single target, or do I keep Life Bloom on myself in order to provide more AoE healing type of deal? Instead, it's just kind of like, keep those two things on them and you'll be fine. So a lot of people are gonna either hate it or love it. I feel that it eats up a lot of your global cooldowns when I want to spend them on DPS or something else. Generally speaking, it is a very, very solid HPS legendary, and if you like the playstyle, you can go for it and have a good time. So you can see that the pure HPS value of Dark Titans is pretty good, especially when combined, or you should combine it with photosynthesis. Then you'll see Memory of Mother Tree for both raids and Mythic Plus being a solid option, and definitely a pick, a #1 pick if you're just looking for one legendary. You'll see Lucar's Fleeting Glimpse. It's not extremely popular in Mythic Plus. Verdant Diffusion is becoming more and more sought after in a lot of content that is to do with single target. This is going to be something that's going to be used for your Sunking, because again, Sunking is a single target fight, and it's going to be used on certain Mythic Plus dungeons or certain Mythic Plus comps. So a lot of Resto Druids do tend to pick this just for the pure single target healing aspect, because there's so much single target damage. It is very popular in PvP as well. If we look at the popularity for Mythic Plus legendaries right now, you'll see that it is actually the second most popular legendary, because again, like I mentioned, there is a lot of tank damage happening. Would I recommend this for majority of people? Probably not. I think you should actually know the exact reasons why you would craft this legendary or why you need it. A lot of the times I think that, again, Memory of Mother Tree provides, you know, good HPS, doesn't eat up global cooldowns for raids and Mythic Plus. Again, do you need that single target healing? Verdant Diffusion might be an option. Really, really consider it. My favorite Mythic Plus legendary is going to be Circle of Life and Death. There is no HPS value associated with this. Like, again, I showed you sub-creation here. This is showing real player information. These players are doing 20 plus keys. You'll see the talent builds that they're using. Again, they're using Flourish for that DPS aspect for Convoke. You'll see the Circle of Life that is becoming the #1 option for this. Your damage overtime effects deal the damage in 25% less time, and your healing overtime effects in 15% less time. So all of a sudden, your hots and dots, they're kind of going to have more impact soon. And why am I saying this as a good thing? In Mythic Plus, at least I feel there is going to be a lot of moments where people need to be constantly topped up, or someone's gonna take damage, they drop to like 20%, and they need to be topped up that instant because they're going to die. Or a tank is getting completely bashed and they need a lot of that, you know, instant or quicker healing. And a lot of the time, Circle Life with Death is going to be a solid option, especially when you combine it with a lot of haste, because a lot of Resto Druids are looking at a lot of haste in mythic situations. We'll talk about stat priority. So Circle Life with Death gives you more impact. This is not the main reason that people are using Circle Life with Death. Circle Life with Death is going to provide DPS. DPS is a big thing for Resto Druids. So all of a sudden, Legendary that gives you a decent value in terms of HPS and provides you with more DPS is gonna have a lot of value in mythical situation. Circle Life and Death in raids is going to be a lot different. A lot of the times it might not fit the damage patterns. It's going to shorten your HUDs. So all of a sudden, certain damage patterns might require you to have HUDs that are going to last for longer. You're gonna have shorter HUDs. You're gonna provide or use more healing overtime abilities, which might mean more mana issues. So all of a sudden, Circle Life that can have a negative effect in raid situations, and a lot of people will not recommend using Circle Life of Death in raids. It is only mainly used in Mythic Plus. So, short version of this, if you can only upgrade one Legendary, Memory of Mother Tree is very solid option. In Mythic Plus, or if you're looking to optimize your Mythic Plus performance because you're pushing high keys and you want to provide damage, Circle Life of Death is probably going to be the most popular option right now. If you're struggling with single target healing and you're doing PvP, Verdant Diffusion could actually be another good option. If you like Dark Titan's Lesson, if you enjoy the playstyle, the HPS that it can provide with photosynthesis is going to be really strong. And if you're looking for the best Legendary for raid situations, it's going to be Vision of Unending Growth. It's not going to be great in Mythic Plus. So this is my summary of Legendary. Now let's go have a look at stat priority for Resto Druids both in Raid and Mythic Plus. At the start, we're gonna go and have a look at the Raid stat priority. And like I mentioned throughout many guide videos on my streams, highest item level is always going to be winner at the start of this expansion. Intellect has an insanely good value, and a lot of the times you're not going to be dropping item level. There is a difference between a lot of stats like Leech, like I talked about before, but this is going to be questionably epic stat priority value for Resto Druid in raid situations, and this is something that a lot of people are going to follow. Haste being number one, and then followed by everything else. So if you right click on your Druid for your raid situations, you'll notice that, hey, Haste has a really high value. After that, you pretty much have Crit versus Mastery being very close to each other, with Leech being having a solid option as well. So if you can get Leech, especially in your rings and jewelry, you might be dropping item levels just to use that Leech piece in raid situations. Keep in mind, in Mythic Plus, Leech is going to drop value because it has less impact. These stats are basically generated from other players playing the Resto Druid and basically other logs. And this is not just coming out of thin air or something. This is actually something backed up by theory crafting. And I feel it provides a good option because Haste is a very solid option, especially if you're using that Vision of Unending Growth Legendary, which also scales very nicely with Haste. And Haste generally makes your Resto Druid feel a lot better, but you can see how much better Intellect is. So a lot of the times you're not dropping item level, but if you can get it, you'll try and get those haste pieces. Now let's go and have a look at the dungeon setup. And dungeon setup is going to be a lot different because mastery exists. And mastery, a lot of the times you have to ask yourself, do you want to provide DPS or do you want to go full healing build? So now if you click the setup here, you'll notice that the stats have changed. Leech has dropped a lot of value, haste is still really strong, and mastery has become the second best stat. So generally speaking, it's going to be haste equals mastery, and then probably verse equals crit. So very close together, dividing the stats into two kind of categories. Why haste and mastery? Now, first of all, haste is very important for us to Druid because a lot of your abilities are instant cast, and there's going to be a thing called global cooldown. After you cast an ability, you'll notice that you can't cast a second ability for a specific period of time. That specific period of time is going to be changed by haste. So the more haste you have, the quicker you can put out your hots, your dots, your bleeds, whatever you want. And it makes the class feel a lot better in my opinion. So I would actually value haste as being the best stat for us to Druid in mythical situations. And a lot of people are going to be, I should clarify, the best secondary stat. At the end of the day, intellect is the king. But you'll notice that a lot of Resto Druids who are doing high content will try to get haste on every single piece. They'll enchant haste on rings. This is very important because it's going to make the playstyle a lot smoother in my opinion. Why mastery is so important? Mastery is one of your best healing stats in the game. The more hots you have on a person, the more healing you're going to provide. So just consider the amount of hots you can have on a person. You can have things like Scenario Word. Regrowth is going to apply a hot. Wild Growth is going to apply a hot. Rejuvenation is going to apply a hot. Spring Blossom is going to apply a hot. there is a lot of ways of applying HOTS to members of your party, and this is going to increase your healing. So this is why Mastery is very strong. Keep in mind that there are Resto Druids who are not afraid to drop Mastery because they want to go a more DPS oriented build, because Mastery is not providing with damage. If you're a new Resto Druid, I definitely recommend Haste Mastery. Just Haste Mastery is going to be a really solid option. If you're a Druid who's looking to push damage, you might be looking to drop a bit of Mastery in order to provide something like more Verse, which is going to give you damage reduction and going to give you DPS. Verse and Haste are arguably one of the best stats if you're looking to provide pure DPS. But I don't want to go too much into it. At the end of the day, Intellect is the king. Haste Mastery really strong in Mythic Plus, followed by Crit Verse or Verse Crit, depending on how you view DPS. Let's have a look at Resto Druid gameplay, especially in raid situations, and how you should optimize raid healing as a Druid. So first of all, as a Druid, you have bread and butter. As any healer, you have bread and butter abilities that basically need to have as high of an uptime as possible in order to maximize your class. And again, Efflorescence is one of those. Especially if you're using Spring Blossoms, you want to make sure you're gonna hit as many people as you can. It's going to apply Spring Blossoms 3 people at a time, so it's going to spread, and it's going to work towards your Mastery stacking. So all of a sudden, you can actually track on your grid too which people have it. A lot of the times it might be melee, and the more HOTS you're gonna have on that person, the more Mastery healing you're gonna get from it. So simple ways of optimizing it. Outside of that, you're gonna have things like Life Bloom. Keep that on a tank. It's going to have a chance of proccing clear casting, which is gonna make your growth free. All of a sudden, it has some hidden value to it. If you're running, again, in raid situations, you're probably not gonna be running Photosynthesis. Maybe you might be running the double Life Bloom legendary. If you are, you'll probably have to keep Life Bloom on yourself. But this is pretty rare because you'll probably be running Vision of Unending Growth or Memory of Mother Tree in raids. So outside of that, outside of Efflorescence, outside of Life Bloom, you'll notice that you have things like Scenario Word. I really like Scenario Word, so in raid situations or Mythic Plus, I tend to keep it on the tank at all times. So it's going to be here. And how do you optimize your healing outside of that? Pre-hotting and things like that are going to exist. A lot of people might not know what pre-hotting is, but basically as a Resto Druid, you'll be trying to apply HOTS before damage comes out. If the damage happens, and only then you're going to put out your rejuvenations, your wild growths, your healing is going to suffer because other healers are going to try to snipe you or possibly snipe you. We'll have to see. So generally speaking, if you know damage is about to happen, you should be trying to apply your HOTS. It's something similar to Discipline Priest playstyle with atonements, and this is why Resto Druid can be viewed as a difficult healer to optimize in raid situations, because you need to know when damage is incoming. If you don't know this, you won't be able to pre-hot. Outside of that, using Wild Growth for damage situations is pretty much a no-brainer. Wild Growth is going to be extremely strong, especially with the fact that you're probably going to be using Dreamweaver and you're probably going to be using Unstoppable Growth as your main potency conjure. So Wild Growth, main AoE heal. Regrowth or Rejuvenation as a tool to pre-hot is going to be very strong. Keeping Efflorescence down, keeping Life Bloom down, keeping Scenario Word on cooldown is going to be pretty much a go-to. How do you set up for AoE healing? How do you use Tranquility? How do you use Tree of Life? And how do you use Flourish? You'll have to notice that Flourish has 2 different baked-in portions. It used to be 2 spells, but then it got changed to 1 later down the line. So extends the duration of all your heal overtime effects. This is only going to extend the duration of the HOTS that have been applied before using Flourish. And the second part increases the rate of your heal overtime effects by 100% for 8 seconds. This is dynamic. Even if you press Flourish and then you cast Regrowth or Rejuvenation, the hot portion is going to be affected by this. Majority of the things in the game are dynamic, but the hot extension portion is only going to work for HOTS that have been pre-applied. So if you're using Scenario Word, for example, if you're about to use Flourish, you want to make sure you have as many rejuvenations out there as possible. You want to make sure that you might cast Wild Growth and might use Scenario Word. So for example, I'm applying a ton of rejuvenations. Let's assume this is a raid party. I applied Scenario Word, I use Wild Growth, and then I cast Flourish. My HOTS are going to be extended. Now Scenario Word, the portion, Scenario Word works in a different way because it's going to activate the hot portion with the damage hits. So you can track that as well. So generally speaking, you want to make sure you have as many HOTS out as possible before using Flourish. Very important. In the same way that you're going to be using your Tranquility. Tranquility is going to apply hot on every person that gets hit by it. So all of your raids should have this hot. This hot is going to work, or heal over time effect, is going to work with Mastery. So generally speaking, you want to have, again, as many hots out as possible before using Tranquility. A lot of the times people will use the same kind of thing. Apply Rejuves on everybody, use Wild Growth, and then press Tranquility. Now all of a sudden myself has Rejuvenation, has a Wild Growth hot, and has the Tranquility hot as well. So now my mastery is working more. And you can extend this with Flourish. So there's multiple ways of combining raid cooldowns. You have to decide before approaching a raid fight, okay, this fight is going to be 5 or 6 minutes long. I know there's going to be damage happening every 2 minutes or so. How am I going to approach this fight? Where am I going to use Convoke for healing? Convoke is a 2-minute cooldown. Where am I going to use Tranquility for healing? Do I want to extend Tranquility by Flourish because there's going to be continuous AoE healing happening? Or do I want to use Flourish by itself? Do I want to use Tree of Life at the beginning of the fight because Tree of Life is going to reduce the cost of a lot of my spells, and I can use Tree of Life as a mana saving tool to pre-hot the raid members? That's actually doable. You can use Tree of Life before damage comes out because rejuvenation cost is going to be reduced and rejuvenation is going to heal for a lot more. Resto Druid has a lot of raid cooldowns. If you go into a fight and have no idea where you're going to be using your abilities, you're going to have a bad time in raid situations. You need to have in your head a good timeline of how you're going to be using your cooldowns, how you're going to be combining them. You have Innervate as well. So it is difficult. During Tree of Life, you'll notice that you have empowered abilities. A lot of the times the priority for Tree of Life is going to be applying as many rejuvenations as possible, making sure you use Wild Growth on cooldown, and again, you still have to use your bread and butter kind of consensus. You still have to make sure you have efflorescences open, things like that. Think of Tree of Life as a throughput cooldown and a mana saving cooldown. Your rejuvenation is costing less mana. If you look at your spellbook for rejuvenation, you can see that Tree of Life healing is increased by 50, or rejuvenation under the Tree of Life, healing increased by 50% and mana cost reduced by 30. And like I mentioned before, if you look at your Wild Growth as a Resto Druid, under the effect of Tree of Life affects 2 additional targets. So you can use Tree of Life multiple different ways. You can use Tranquility multiple different ways. You can extend the Tranquility hot by using Flourish. You can use Convoke the Spirit. Again, in raid situations, you're probably going to use Convoke the Spirit in your normal form in order to basically do healing. So guys, name of the game as Resto Druid, bread and butter abilities, Fluorescence, Life Bloom, Scenario Ward, pre-hotting, using Innovate as often as possible in order to have maximum mana efficiency. Having mana potions is important. Having things like Potion of Spiritual Clarity is really important. And then just having an idea in your head of where and when you're going to use your cooldowns. A lot of the times you want to spread them. You don't want to chain them unless the fight is actually continuous AoE fight like Enerva or something along those lines. So now let's go and have a look at the Mythic Plus gameplay. So for Mythic Plus, the gameplay is going to be a little bit different because you're not going to be using Tree of Life, or a lot of times you're not going to be using Tree of Life. In Mythic Plus situations, you're going to be using Soul of the Forest. You might be using Photosynthesis, or you might be going with Flourish, depending on what you really want. But the general consensus is going to be, how can you keep as many hots as possible on the people in your party group? This shouldn't be that difficult considering you only have 5 people to look after. And a lot of the times a lot of your abilities are going to drop hots. The main gameplay associated for Mythic Plus, in my opinion, is going to be in terms of how you're going to use your Swiftman. Swiftman now requires a hot to be on a party member in order for Swiftman to go off. It has a priority system of which hots is going to remove first if you have a ton of hots on a party member or a raid member or whatever. So, with Soul of the Forest, with Swiftman, you're going to have a lot of lenience in terms of what you want to use. So, for example, I see a lot of people doing this, and myself included at the start, because it took me a while to get used to the Swiftman requiring a hot. A lot of the times I played Resto Druid for a long time, and you don't need anything on them to use it, but in Shadowlands it's a lot different. So when someone is losing HP, I see a lot of people, this person is 10% HP, and they're like, oh crap, my Swiftman is not working, and they apply rejuvenation and then they use Swiftman because they panic and they're like, oh, this person is going to die. At the end of the day, you're still governed by a global cooldown. And why not just try to practice and do something like, oh, hey, this person is 10% HP. I'm just going to use my Regrowth. Regrowth is going to apply a hot on them because you have to remember, Regrowth has a hot portion, and then I can use a Swiftman on them. So all of a sudden I get 2 quick direct heals onto that person, they should be okay. Of course, if that person already has HOTS on them, you're not going to hesitate and you're just going to use Swiftmend on them straight away. But this is something that I've seen a lot of people using and a lot of people misplaying it. In terms of Swiftmend and what you should use your Swiftmend on, honestly, it's all dependent on the situation. If you have your Soul of the Forest buff after using Swiftmend, a lot of times AoE situations you're going to be using on Wild Growth. If someone needs direct healing, you're going to be using Regrowth. The probably most common usage is going to be a tank is getting really wrecked. You have HOTS on the tank because you should always maintain HOTS on the tank. Use Swiftmend and they still need a lot more healing. You're going to be using it into Empowered Regrowth. So without talking too much, Soul of the Forest, extremely flexible, depends on what you need. Swiftmend, get used to the fact that a person needs to have a HOT on them in order to use Swiftmend because it's going to be your bread and butter. Again, you're using the same kind of thing with Spring Blossoms. The Fluorescence is still very strong. You're still maintaining Light Bloom on a target because it's going to give you Mastery stacks. You're still using Wild Growth when there's AoE healing needed. You're spreading your rejuvenations. And in a lot of boss fights and trash pack fights, you might want to have rejuvenation on all the party members before going in because you know there's going to be AoE damage. So it's a very similar type of playstyle. This is something that is very important in my opinion. Nature Swiftness is going to be extremely strong because it's going to empower your next Regrowth, Rebirth, or Untangling Roots to be instant, free, and castable in all forms and healing for an additional 100%. Now, Nature Swiftness is off global cooldown. What does that mean? You can basically macro it and you can achieve the same result of applying Nature Swiftness into Regrowth by one click. So this is my Nature Swiftness macro. Very simple. I highly recommend people getting it. I have cast Nature Swiftness and then cast on mouse over Regrowth. What this is going to do with one simple click, because like I mentioned, Nature Swiftness is not on global cooldown, it's going to empower my Regrowth and it's going to heal for a ton. If I want to have even more healing, I can just I can proc my Soul of the Forest and then look what happens when I click my ability. This actually used Nature Swiftness into Regrowth within one single click. And this is why macroing abilities that don't have global cooldown is extremely important because it's going to save you additional time and it's going to optimize your healer. So this is something that I definitely recommend a lot of people using it. I also have to pinpoint that if you are into Balance Affinity and if you're using things like Double Life Bloom Legendary, which again I have crafted, I've used this. I'm not a huge fan of it in terms of gameplay, but I do see the HVS potential. In Balance Affinity, you can actually apply Life Blooms without going out of your Balance Affinity. So you can see me applying Life Blooms right here. If I don't have this legendary, and if I go into a Balance Affinity, and if I apply Life Bloom, I get taken out. So there is definitely some tips and tricks on optimizing your legendaries and Balance Affinity. So now that we're talking about Balance Affinity, let's go and talk about DPS as Resto Druid. In this guide, I'm mainly going to be focusing on Balance Affinity because it is basically the meta right now. If you are running Feral Affinity, there's no... Again, Feral Affinity is definitely viable and you can make it work, and it's probably my favorite affinities right now, but I definitely have to say that Balance is very strong, especially if you're using Night Fae, if you're using Convoke the Spirits. It's easy to use. Being ranged is a lot less difficult than being melee right now, and the fact that you have Typhoon is also a really solid option. So how do you DPS as a boomkin in Shadowlands? So first of all, you're going to have, again, you can make this as complicated as you want. I'm going to try and give you a very basic overview. You have Starfire and you have Rat. If you cast 2 Rats, you're going to activate Lunar Eclipse. If you cast 2 Starfires, you're going to activate Solar Eclipse. And while within the Solar Eclipse or Lunar Eclipse, you can use things like Star Surge to buff the actual eclipse itself. So without getting too complicated, what is the playstyle? What is the rotation? Because a lot of the times as Resto Druid, first of all, you need to make sure you have enough time to DPS. You have to notice that if you combine it with Heart of the Wild has an uptime of 45 seconds. I can almost guarantee you, you're never ever gonna make use of all of those 45 seconds. You're gonna have like, again, without giving you arbitrary numbers, you're gonna have these bursts available to you where no one needs healing and you can go into DPS or you can go into Balance Affinity and you can start doing DPS. And after that, you're gonna still have to apply HOTS. Keep in mind that, like I mentioned, in Balance Affinity, you can use Regrowth without shifting out. And if you have the double Life Bloom legendary, you can use Life Bloom without shifting out as well. If you're dealing with 3+ members like right now, we're going to assume that our Starfire, again, it only has a 5-yard range compared to Balance 8-yard, but generally speaking, we'll assume that's gonna hit everybody here. In 3+ members, you want to make sure you're keeping Sunfire and everybody. You want to make sure you have Moonfire on them. and you basically want to go into the lunar eclipse. To go into lunar eclipse, you need to cast 2 rats. So right now we're casting 2 rats, and after this we're going to be entering into lunar eclipse. This means we can spam Starfire. You can also should be using Star Surge on cooldown, maintaining dots on everybody. Again, it can be globally intensive or global intensive, and you're spamming Starfire. That's basically your whole goal. Go into lunar eclipse and spam Starfire. Right now, what happened here by casting Starfire, I went into solar eclipse. I should be, in theory, if this was a single target or 2 target fight, I would be casting Rat. But right now we're facing 3+ members, and I'm ignoring solar Rat, or I'm ignoring solar eclipse. I'm just spamming Starfire. So keeping dots up, Moonfire, Sunfire on everybody here in this scenario, making sure that I go into lunar eclipse when possible by casting 2 rat, making sure I'm casting Starfire, and making sure I'm casting Star Surge on cooldown is a simple priority system. So now let's assume we're going to be approaching a trash pack with 6+ members. Your priority is going to change a bit. You're no longer going to be applying Moonfire because it's just going to take too long to apply Moonfire on all these members, and you're no longer going to be using Star Surge because it's just going to be better to just use Starfire. You have to remember, if your Starfire can hit all of those people, it's going to be insanely strong. So at the end of the day, you're just basically applying Sunfire on 6+ members, and you're casting Starfire. Now, if you can actually go into lunar eclipse, you should do it. So in this case, I can actually cast 2 rats, and I can go into lunar eclipse and start casting Starfire. Maintain my Sunfire, casting Starfire all the time. So basically, very simple. You're ignoring Moonfires, you're ignoring Star Surges. You're just basically trying to get into lunar eclipse if possible. If not, you're just spamming Starfire and you're applying Sunfires, as you can see. Like I mentioned before, in a 3+ priority, you have a bit more of global cooldown intensive gameplay with applying your Moonfires, applying your Sunfires, making sure, again, you're always trying to get into that Starfire in these AoE situations or lunar eclipse, so you can spam that Starfire, spam that Star Surges in 3+, and ignore Star Surges later in a big trash packs. So how do you want to optimize your balance affinity when you're opening up on a boss? And for example, maybe you have hired the wild, you have Convoke, and you saved it all to do a really massive amount of burst. The bread and butter is to have a checklist of what you need to have before you're going to be activating Convoke the Spirits. First of all, you're going to want to activate Convoke the Spirits while in Boomkin form. While in Boomkin form, this is going to prioritize your Boomkin abilities. Second of all, you want to make sure that you're kind of far away from, you're not in the melee range or a good bit away from the mob itself, because if you're too close, Convoke the Spirit might be proccing things like trash, like your Guardian Druid abilities, which is, again, not wanted. Second of all, the checklist. You want to make sure you pop Heart of the Wild, because Heart of the Wild is going to increase your damage. You want to make sure you're inside an eclipse. So, for example, lunar or solar. A lot of times, for single target situations, you'll want to be in solar eclipse. In order to proc solar eclipse, you'll have to cast 2 Starfires. You can see it here. I have a weak word that tells me how many spells I need to cast in order to proc an eclipse. I need to cast 1 solar rat. Again, I already casted another one. But if I cast 2 Starfires, it's going to proc solar eclipse. So a priority checklist or a sample might look like this. Keep in mind, this is open to interpretation in terms of how you're going to use your Star Surges. A lot of people might use their Star Surge before or after. It really depends on how much time you have available to DPS. But generally speaking, you want to make sure you have Moonfire and Sunfire available on mobs or on them. That's just bread and butter. You always want to make sure they have this. You want to go into your eclipse, and for example, I'm going to proc my Starfire. I'm into solar eclipse. I'm proccing my Heart of the Wild, and then I'm using Convoke. Now, because I'm kind of far away, it's not using any of the trash abilities, and it's focusing on the member here. This is going to be like a bread and butter opener for Resto Druid using Balance Affinity. You're not always going to have these eclipses available based on the rotation. So sometimes, for example, right now, I can only cast Rat twice, and that's going to proc my lunar eclipse. And if I'm using Heart of the Wild, you'll notice that I can use my Star Surge instantly. So Star Surge is also going to buff that eclipse. So all of a sudden, the cast time, Starfire's cast time is reduced and critical strike chance increased. You can see that the playstyle is relatively simple, but it can be convoluted when you're trying to really macro certain abilities together. So for example, because Convoke the Spirit is such an important ability, you can macro a lot of things to it. I have berserking macro to it. You can have a potion, like for example, you can have an intellect potion. A lot of the times people might be using something like potion of phantom fire that you can use before proccing convoke. You can have unused trinket. So all of a sudden you might have a scenario where you would, for example, go into your boomkin affinity, apply moonfire, sunfire, go into your eclipse, something like starfire, you're into solar eclipse for a single target, you apply your Heart of the Wild. You might then use this macro to proc your convoke, but also use all of these racials and all these inpots and potions in order to do more damage. And then after that, you're basically going into your follow the eclipses, use Star Surge on cooldown, and you should be okay. There is some debate about using Star Surge before using convoke and things like that. Again, there's a lot of open interpretations for this. Now, I have seen an issue with this macro and convoke the spirits if you are spamming this macro or the ability before it. So I was able to replicate it a couple of times, but honestly, if I'm, for example, I'm using a checklist when I'm approaching a boss. Do I have Heart of the Wild? Do I have Moonfire, Sunfire on a boss? Am I inside an Eclipse? So if I'm trying to proc an Eclipse, for example, in this case, I'm going to try to use Wrath. If I'm spamming Wrath and then spamming the ability right afterwards, like I'm trying to activate my convoke right afterwards, I can have an issue where I'm finishing the cast of Wrath or Starfire and convoke goes off, but my racial berserking goes off afterwards and interrupts the cast completely. And I was able to replicate it a couple of times by just spamming this macro after finishing a spell. Now, I've tried to fix this by having a non-channeling tag, a channeling tag, a stop macro tag, and honestly I was not able to fix it. The only way I can prevent this bug from ever happening is that I make sure that I get into an Eclipse and then I click the macro. Once, I don't spam it. I need to make sure I finish the current cast. Otherwise, I run into a possibility of completely canceling convoke and it's going to be a disaster. So keep that in mind if you're going to end up using this macro. Be very careful with spamming it after finishing a cast. Overall, I think it's a very, very solid way of doing damage. If you're doing 1 or 2 targets, you're just basically following your eclipses. If you're in solar eclipse, you're trying to use your Wrath. If you're in lunar eclipse, you're trying to use your Starfire and things like that. So this is the general consensus of how you play your boomkin in terms of DPS. There is a ways to optimize your Star Surge, like in terms of which eclipse you are and how many members you have. But I don't want to overcomplicate it. At the end of the day, you'll be using your Star Surge on cooldown as long as there's no 6+ targets. Again, I don't want to be too overcomplicated in terms of DPS because it feels like this is a healing guide, but also I spend more time looking at the DPS. I'm not looking at Feral Affinity because right now Feral Affinity is probably not in the meta. I do like Feral Affinity a lot, but I'm not going to be looking at the overall rotation. Let me know if I missed out on something in terms of Resto Druid healing. I didn't want this video to be very long, but it just ended up being very, very long. Let me know if I missed out on something in terms of balance affinity DPS. I'm not perfect at the end of the day. There's a lot of other resources you can double check. Questionably Epic is amazing. Let me know if you know any tips for Resto Druid, both in Mythic and raids that I missed out. I'll read the comments and I'll see you in my next